vulnerability is taking the risk of exposing your truth at the risk of ridicule, at the risk of being judged, at the risk of being criticized.
And I think that both of those are great human experiences because it helps you when you do turn, frustration into fascination, which then lands you in transformation. It only happens because you have some degree of emotional pain and concern. Conscious couples, business partners, and singles committed to attracting their dream partner. Welcome to the Conscious Couples podcast, where we share our life, love story, and combined relationship expertise to help you create and consistently cultivate the most magnificent, intimate relationship possible.
Never again will you feel hopeless and alone in your intimate relationship challenges.
Having accumulated thousands of hours coaching conscious couples and individuals all over the world, as well as starting and growing a global business together, Alan and I are here to guide you in all things relationships.
Thank you again for tuning into the one place where it's not about you or me, it's about the we. Conscious couples and individuals from all over the globe, welcome back to the Conscious Couples podcast. Real quick, how cool is it that we can speak into the lives of people from all over the world?
Oh my gosh, it's my favorite thing.
Technology.
Personally.
30 years ago, this was not a possibility.
Mm-hmm.
I Googled it recently, babe. 5 billion individuals are now on the internet. Very cool. Very, very
need
cool.
like 2 point something more to get all over the globe.
Yeah. Well,
world population.
A little more than that, love.
Yeah.
Because the population is growing exponentially. But so is the amount of people on the internet, which is very good. So the world has access to amazing information. So we're so grateful to be able to do this. First, a quick shout out to the NLPS team, Next Level Podcast Solutions. Thank you for producing this on YouTube, audio, the whole nine, show notes. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Today's episode number 29, is creating a safe space for vulnerability. Vulnerability is a word that I did not really understand until my late 20s. Kevin and Taryn, my business partner Kevin and his now wife Taryn, watched a documentary on Netflix by the one and only Brene Brown about vulnerability, and they also watched her TED Talk on vulnerability, and Kevin started talking to me about vulnerability on the Hyperconscious podcast, which is now Next Level University, and I didn't know what he was talking about.
What was your first reaction to learning about vulnerability?
I don't think I understood what it really meant, what it looked like. I had never really studied it before. And I was actually on the phone with a client earlier, and one of my homework assignments for her was The Power of Vulnerability by Brene Brown. It's an audio series on Audible, one of the best audio programs I've ever personally leveraged or used or enjoyed. So Brene Brown's work on vulnerability is amazing. It's what she's known for. It's phenomenal. But for the purposes of this episode, I remember asking Kevin, like, what is vulnerability? What does that really mean? And I didn't know this, but I do think that I've always been fairly good at this. And I think one of the reasons why is because I was raised by two women. So my father passed away in a car accident when I was 2 years old. And I did have a stepfather from ages 3 to 14, but I never really looked up to my stepfather very much. I never really considered him my dad. As a matter of fact, I remember my mom talking about trying to consider him my dad, and she gave me the choice to change my name to Lazaros and all of that. But growing up with women, I think that I really had a more healthy relationship with vulnerability than what I've now noticed and I've now come to understand is a lot of men that have father figures. There was a lot of lack of vulnerability in the masculine energy in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. And I think that there's a real transformation going on in the world where healthy masculinity is on the rise. And I think that, as we know, females and the feminine energy is really starting to be heard in ways that we've never had in human history, which is really, really cool. And at NLU, our main demographic is women. I know that's true at Evolve Ventures as well. So, and then the Conscious Couples podcast is primarily women as well. So it's a wonderful thing. And this is not a male versus woman thing. This is a masculine and feminine thing. And I don't want to exclude anybody because I know there's people who don't identify with either of those. But my point here is this. Vulnerability is not talked about enough. Vulnerability is not taught in school. Vulnerability is not necessarily modeled. I coach people from all over the world, not only at Conscious Couples, but at NLU. And what I've come to understand is that different countries and different cultures have very different understandings of vulnerability and whether or not it's appropriate. And I didn't know this, but I'm on the higher end of being vulnerable as a man. And while I do think I've struggled with it in the past for sure, I've always been someone who's open to having heart-to-hearts and talking about deep things and talking about how I feel. And I've definitely come up a lot on that, lately, and being completely vulnerable here to model this on this episode. I just want to share this. This podcast is hands down the most vulnerable thing I've ever done other than my relationship with Emilia. And this podcast is in large part about our relationship because we want to lead by example on the Conscious Couples podcast, and we are a conscious couple, and obviously we're teaching our listeners what we're learning in our relationship. And so think about what level of vulnerability it would require to share your most intimate love story with the world, with complete strangers. And that's what I wanted to open with, is vulnerability is taking the risk of exposing your truth at the risk of ridicule, at the risk of being judged, at the risk of being criticized. And the very last thing I'll say before I have Emilia jump in here, I always used to say this: you cannot do something in life that is remarkable without expecting it to be remarked upon. And if a lot of people are negative, you have to expect a lot of negative feedback as well as positive. Whenever you do something remarkable in the world, it's going to be remarked upon, and not all of it's going to be positive. And so vulnerability, whether it's in a relationship or in general, is the willingness to have courage, humility, and to risk being exposed. And we've done that a lot on this podcast, and we're doing that literally in this episode. So we're going to talk about a couple things. One is creating a safe space for vulnerability in your relationship. How do you do that? Emilia's great at that. And I'm going to talk about what I didn't understand was an unconscious competency of how to actually be vulnerable in a relationship.
Meaning something that Alan's really, really good at without him really realizing it.
Oh, unconscious. Yeah.
Yep.
Competency.
So, the first thing that I was going to ask you, which you already did for us, which is beautiful, defining vulnerability.
What's your definition, love?
I would echo yours because I think, and we talked about this right before, I'm not nearly, and this is interesting too, because I am not nearly as good, and some people might get shocked by this, but I'm not nearly as good as Alan when it comes to vulnerability. And so my definition is still evolving. I'm still exploring it and still even understanding what that looks like for me. And a lot of that is attributed to, my experience with vulnerability. Vulnerability is very much like exposing yourself at the risk of ridicule or harm or social threat. It's opening yourself up to loss, I think. And I think that's a very scary place to be for many different parts of us, which get so hung up on how important it is to have a feeling, a sense of security, a sense of belonging, something like that. So
real quick, love.
Yeah.
Emilia and I watched the Hobbit series together, and it's one of her favorite series ever. And the dragon, remember how it has a missing scale?
Yeah.
That's the dragon's one vulnerability.
Oh, yeah.
And so vulnerability is essentially risking danger.
Yeah.
The problem is that we armor up, in this case, dragon scales, to try not to get hurt by others, but we also end up never getting close to others because of it.
Yeah, that's true.
And so that's a good, I think, analogy for vulnerability.
Yeah, very true. Yeah, we all have like such an armor. I was actually talking about this with someone today on my team, how we all have protectors. Like, your ego wants to tell you that you're protector free, that you're armor free, but in reality, that's not actually the case. So vulnerability is a skill. It is something that you can develop if you've never really experienced that realm before. It definitely is something that can open you up to a deeper emotional connection, especially when it comes to your partner. So starting with that, there was a moment that we had on the couch the other night where Alan was in a very vulnerable space, and I I now recognize that because it's Alan's representation of vulnerability. You can see it in the flesh. You can see it in his energy. You can see it in his heart, even just like the orb that's around him. And I, as a conscious, partner, I really try to tune into and plug into my partner's energy all the time, and to when I can be receptive to that and handle that and love on that. So there was a moment yesterday, babe, when we were on the couch, and I think we were on the couch eating dinner last night. And
bedroom.
Was it bedroom?
Yeah, bedroom.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yep. And you had said, I don't know if I had to ask what was wrong, but you just proactively brought something to my attention that you had shame around. Mm-hmm. And it was a beautiful proactive. You wanted to clear the glass with me because I had experienced you in the moment that actually created the shame that you had, that you wanted to talk to me about. So in that moment, as an attentive partner, I think that the number one thing that I want to make sure that I bring into this episode, because I'm told by so many people how easy it is to trust me, how safe of a person I am to other people. So I've gotten this compliment a lot. So to Alan's point, this is an unconscious competency of mine, aka it comes really easy to me to create that safe space for vulnerability to happen. And so I definitely attribute it to these three things that I'm going to share with all of our listeners. And these three things are primarily, something that I've developed certainly over time, but as a listener, you can develop this too. And I want to really make sure that we start there. So go ahead.
Do you mind if I tell the story first before, just to give context?
Yeah.
So I don't want to interrupt you. Okay. So, and I should have opened with that, but that's okay.
Yeah.
All right. So yesterday, I had a really tough call with my COO and CFO, and it revealed some mirrors to me about some different frustrations that I've had with the way in which I influence, and I'm just being kind of high level on that. I ended up coming downstairs, and Emilia could tell that I was in a vulnerable state, and she's like, "What's wrong? Are you okay?" And you were working on the couch, and I talked to you about it, and I got really frustrated, and essentially what happened is in my frustration, I ended up saying something unkind about someone that I do like and that I do think is a good person. And no one's perfect. And while I do think there's some validity and some truth to what I had expressed, I later on that night, Emilia and I had been done eating. We finished a movie together, the tail end of the fourth Hunger Games movie, so part 2 of Mockingjay. And we were just talking before bed, and I said, I have some shame around something that I wanted to share with you. What I said about that person really was not my truth. It wasn't your full truth. It wasn't my full truth. It was an over-exaggerated, passionate, frustrated version of the truth, and here's my real truth. My real truth is this, and now that I'm in a more centered state, I want to clarify, and I do have some shame because I do like this person a lot, and I don't think they deserved that.
Yeah.
So who here, listening or watching, has ever spoken behind someone you care about's back and then felt shame around that or guilt? Everyone. I don't know a single person who hasn't made a mistake in this regard when they were in a heated moment of overzealousness, for lack of better phrasing, and they ended up saying something that had some truth in it, but it was an over-exaggerated version. So I was very vulnerable, and I expressed, my shame and my emotions around this whole thing, and I think that there's real transformation in that, because I now know that I'm going to change, and I said that I want to get better at that. I want to get better at making sure that I'm centered in my truth, behind the scenes or front of the scenes.
Yeah.
And so turn your frustration into fascination and your fascination into transformation. That's kind of something we talk about on this podcast. And the only way that you can transform sometimes, pretty much all the time, is to be vulnerable and to risk being exposed to I'm not perfect, and that was not in alignment with who I want to be, and I made a mistake, and kind of sit in the suckiness of that. For lack of better phrasing, because it doesn't feel good to admit then when you're not living up to your own standards. And in that moment, I had some shame around Tucker as well. I was passionate, and I think he got a little bit scared. I ended up picking him up and making sure he was okay. But of course, there was a little bit there too. So that's the context that Emilia is about to bring. She created a safe space energetically for me to express things like that without beating me up while I'm already down. And while she's not gonna make me feel any certain way of like, no, it's totally fine, no big deal, like you did nothing wrong. That's a whole nother level of not allowing someone to sit in their own discomfort of vulnerability. But you can hold a safe space and kind of live in the messy middle, is what I call it, the messy middle of your emotions, where it's like, okay, there's uncertainty and I don't know where this conversation is going to go, but let's see.
Hi everybody, I'm Caleb and this is my beautiful wife Angela. We're pretty new clients to Al and Emilia and their Conscious Couples Coaching.
Yeah, I think we started back in early 2022, around February, and our relationship has completely shifted in a few short months.
I think one of the biggest takeaways from working with them was our communication, which I believe is an obstacle for most couples. I was talking to Ange in a way that I would understand, but it wouldn't connect to her, which caused some arguments. But Al and Emilia were able to point that out, and now I can talk to her how she's going to understand. She can do the same for me.
Yes, our communication is way better than it's ever been. We've been together for about 6 years now. And as well as just really figuring out what our core values personally are, but as well as what they are in our relationship. So being able to communicate from that space is really valuable. So thank you, Alan and Emilia, for everything you've done and for leading the way.
I really believe that both shame and guilt are really important human experiences. And the difference between the two, guilt is I feel bad for doing something that was out of integrity with my standards or my morals or my virtues, where shame, you kind of take that on as an identity where not only did I do something bad, but I am a bad person. And I think that both of those are great human experiences because it helps you when you do turn frustration into fascination, which then lands you in transformation. It only happens because you have some degree of emotional pain and concern. And when you can kind of sit in that discomfort, which has been thrown off as a result of those two emotions, which you actually definitely experienced in those moments, you shifted out of the shame into more of a guilt, where the guilt hung with you, but you realize, you're not a bad person and you did something that was out of integrity with yourself. And that's where the learning was. Okay, I won't go there again, but this was my truth and I was able to honor that. And so I have a saying that we are perfectly imperfect. We are perfectly imperfect beings and we are imperfect, perfect beings. So you can flip that on its head either way that you want, and it still shows the same result, that we are human beings and part of being human is being imperfect. And there is really no such thing as perfection, because when it comes to that, like, we're going to mess up. And we've talked about that in this podcast before. And I think that being able to sit with our mess ups and being able to reflect upon them is one of the most healthiest skills that you can develop, so long as you can work through them with your partner. And so the safe space that you had mentioned energetically that I created was knowing that in advance. I personally hold that we are perfectly imperfect, or we are imperfectly perfect. I hold that knowing that in our relationship. And so energetically, in a way, there's already a forgiveness and a loving towards that part of you that has that safe space to mess up, to go outside of your own standards, but also to love you and give you a warm, energetic hug when you come back to where you are. And so, number one, I think the biggest thing to show that and to display this in energetically, like the moment, is when you are in a state of shame or guilt, or there's a discomfort, knowing that I am not going to be emotionally reactive to whatever you're feeling or doing, really staying emotionally even keeled, meaning like, again, I'm going to be active listening to you when you need to talk about something. I'm going to be really attentive to your needs and to what I can do to support you in that very moment, which means and looks like holding space and just being there for you. while you unpack whatever it is, while you kind of experience what you need to experience, and know that I'm not going to like get triggered by you being triggered or something like that. So that's number one. Number two is making sure that there's a judgment-free zone. And that kind of pertains to the belief that I really hold, that we are perfectly imperfect. And one of the ways in which I think I do a really good job, and you shared with me, babe, at that is in those moments when you are kind of like about to venture into those unpacking moments, is there's like the words that I will give you in those moments is to kind of like, it's okay. Like we can talk about it.
Reassurance.
The reassurance, which is really the number three. Like there's an energetic, like judgment-free zone, but there's the verbal expression of that, the physical touch expression of that, the reassurance of like, I'm not going anywhere. Mm-hmm. I still love you. Like nothing on my end has changed. I'm holding steadfast the love that I have for you and the appreciation for who you are. You're not a bad person. You know, like we're perfectly imperfect. We mess up and that's okay. You know, like now let's talk about the lessons and what you learned through your own personal experience.
And remember, all of this is predicated, and I want to share this as well, on the fact that she trusts that I will grow from it.
Yes.
And I know that there are partners in the past where you didn't trust that they would, that wouldn't continue. Yeah. And so you weren't always able to hold the safe space to the same extent. So if you're out there
Definitely
and you're
not.
watching or listening to this and you don't trust that your partner actually will transform through vulnerability and through this ownership and through making mistakes, this is kind of a whole nother story.
Oh yeah, we have an episode.
And that's a fixed versus growth mindset. We actually have an event about that. All right. So just in the sake of time here, because we do got to jump. So she just talked about how to create a safe space for vulnerability. Mm-hmm. And either partner can be on either end of this. And I'm going to talk about how to actually be vulnerable. What are the ingredients for that? Number one is humility. If I didn't have humility and high standards, quite frankly, there's no way I would even admit to do anything wrong. There's a small part of me, my ego, that wants to say that wasn't even a big deal. Mm-hmm. But that's my ego. And that's not how we get better. Right? And there is a part that says that, but that's not my whole truth. My majority of my truth is, honestly, that was outside of alignment. Let's have the humility to take ownership and be vulnerable and then change this, because this is a train that I know is bad long term, not just for me, but for others as well. So number one is humility. Without humility, there will be no vulnerability. And I've seen that time and time again. Number two is courage. So similar to, the dragon scale, for example. And in this analogy, the dragon had to trust that it wasn't going to get hit in that scale. And it ended up getting hit in that scale and dying in the movie. So spoiler alert for those of you who haven't seen The Hobbit yet. Sorry. What was it? Smaug? The dragon Smaug.
Yeah.
But you have to have courage, because there is always risk. There's always risk with vulnerability. Otherwise, it wouldn't be vulnerable.
Right. If
there's no fear, if there's no risk of danger, if there's no risk of exposure or criticism, there is no need for vulnerability. Everything's fine. So, if you want no risk, you can huddle in a corner. We'll bring you 3 meals a day, cover you with a blanket. I'm joking. It's a Jim Rohn quote. Jim Rohn talks about that. He's like, well, I'm looking for certainty and security. He's like, okay, we'll go huddle in a corner, right? Because obviously dream chasing and falling in love and building businesses and taking risks and applying to jobs and chasing your dreams, all of these things are unbelievably vulnerable. You cannot do them without risking failure, without risking embarrassment. And so, yeah, courage, tremendous. Number 3 is you have to have a purpose for it. So in this case, my purpose was to become a better man, to show Emilia that I'm going to take ownership when I screw up. And the real purpose was to make sure that I take good care of the we. And that includes Tucker. And I want to show Emilia that when we do have children and start a family, I'm going to be able to make course corrections when I screw up. And I know that that's something that she would want to and or need to see in order for us to have the most magnificent family ever. So there has to be a purpose greater than you. If it's just for you, it's not going to work. You're not going to have the why power necessary to actually do it. So the purpose was love, connection, and growth is what I wrote down. And so there you have it. You have one partner trying to hold space and create a safe place for vulnerability. I was on the phone with a client earlier and I said, this will not leave this conversation. Don't worry. It's all good. And she was super vulnerable, which is awesome. And that's why we always keep those things anonymous. We always keep those things private unless we get permission in advance by that specific client to tell that specific story. Otherwise, everything's always anonymous. That's so that we can cultivate vulnerability. And that's why our events are private as well. So, and then there's the being vulnerable, humility, courage, and having a purpose for it. So there you have it. If you weren't taking notes or you were in the car, go back and re-listen and take these notes. Here's how you create a safe space, 3 ingredients. Here's how you actually be vulnerable, 3 ingredients. And it takes practice. So because we got to go here, we have a monthly Relationship Talks event. This is the 15th event in a row. Kind of cool. And it's going to be on overcoming the fixed mindset in your relationship. Again, if one of your partners or the relationship itself has a fixed mindset, there won't be a purpose for vulnerability, because the purpose of vulnerability is always to take ownership, to learn and to grow. And with a fixed mindset, the risk is never going to be worth it, because if you don't believe you can transform, why would you be vulnerable? So September 8th, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. It's not recorded. It's totally private. There will be other conscious couples and singles in there. We can't wait to see you. There will be a link in the show notes.
And kind of just going back to that last sentiment, babe, we got a really nice text message from one of our clients, and we'll obviously keep this anonymous. But what that text had said was something along the lines of, "Thank you so much for helping me to be a better man." And that text, that expression was like, I know we haven't even talked about it, but it warmed my heart to see that, because he had shared how for the first time the male in the relationship, he struggles with vulnerability so much, especially when it comes to opening up about family and stuff like this. And he had said in that text message how he is so grateful to have like been around you, to be around you, and to coach with us, because at the end of the day, like, you create such a safe space for him and model vulnerability for him. So he didn't even know, he didn't have any good models in his life that modeled vulnerability. And it was such a beautiful compliment that we were able to receive so organically from a client of ours. But, at one point that client, they started just like every single listener that is starting here and listening to this, where maybe they struggled with this. Maybe they struggled with, the vulnerability capacity, or maybe they struggle with creating a safe space for vulnerability. Thankfully for this client that we have, his partner is incredible at creating those safe spaces. But it was the struggling with the vulnerability part that really this client, struggled with, and now is doing so much better in this regard. So if you as a listener have ever struggled with vulnerability in your relationship, or if maybe you're on the other end and you've struggled to create that safe space, or maybe both of you guys are struggling in this regard. There's no one really necessarily cultivating that safe space, and the other person doesn't really know how to be vulnerable. Please reach out to Alan and I. We make sure that every single Saturday we have a half hour dedicated on our calendars where you can jump on the phone, completely free, judgment-free zone, where we're not going to sell you anything, but we're just going to be that safe space for you to be able to open up, share what you're struggling with, completely private. And by the end of the call, I can guarantee you that, you'll be in a better place with this whole vulnerability thing and creating a safe space. So book on our calendars. That link is going to be in the show notes, and we would love to meet our listeners, because who knows what that one call could do. It could certainly change your life, and I believe in that.
It will definitely change your trajectory, which will ultimately change where you end up. Book that call, as always, at the Conscious Couples podcast. It's not about you or me. It's about the we.
The we.
We'll talk to you soon.
Bye, everyone. Bye. Thanks for joining us for another episode of the Conscious Couples podcast. We love connecting with the Conscious Couples community, so please make sure you follow us on Instagram. I am at Evolve with Emilia, and Alan is a Lazaros 88.
Also, if you or your partner resonated with this episode, leave us a review at the link in the show notes, and please share this with someone you love and care about.
Until next time, remember, it's not about you or me. It's about
the we.